Welcome to today's live event, 7-Step Reset. For the rest of the December, I'm applying it to crushing anxiety, stopping the anxiety spiral before it begins. This is because if we are in fight or flight or that pre-fight or flight mode, it's very difficult to go from there straight into focus and engage. And what we have to do is be able to apply prevention. It's also very difficult to learn when we're in that stage. It's difficult to perceive what's going on objectively. This is why they talk about the red mist. When people get into that fight or flight, they're literally not able to be aware of things outside of that. It makes sense if you're supposed to be fighting a Serengeti tiger. In January, I'll be going into self-mastery. So 7-Step Reset applies, and I designed it for transformation. Turns out that the work we have to do to transform into something different that we have never done before is not that different from getting back up above the line, that lower line, when we fall through, say, the anxiety spiral or crashing out or whatever it is. And there's two levels of that. There's the crashing out where you come back up to norm within a day or two, but there's the other one where you go into a funk and you stay there for days or weeks. And either one of those require work to get back up, and you can. That's the thing. It's accessible, which is why I'm doing the 7-Step Reset, because there are too many people who think it's impossible. But it's all habitual, and habits are very much within the realm of being possible. Habit change is definitely accessible, but you have to understand it to be able to apply it. And then in February, so January's mastery, February is one-to-one leadership, where I'll take that same 7-step practice, but now we're observing it in other people, because the mastery gets us to where we're not in fight or flight. We're going into focus, engage instead. And now you're able to see and observe. Just remember, your people are using thin slicing to assess you as well, but leaders have an exponential amount of leverage, because while they're reading every signal that you have, they're interpreting it through the lens of their own survivability, right? You're the link to their ice bowl, so to speak. And I think leaders sometimes forget the amount of leverage they have, and they just expect people to understand it or get over it, or just do it this way or just get past it. It doesn't work that way, because they're thinking about their survivability. They're dropped down into that first level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of food, right? And then safety after that. So the 7-Step Reset helps navigate through that. And in March, I'll get into the executive level, one-to-many. And it's not that different. The 7-step model still applies. You're reading other people. The distinction between February and March is that in February, it's leading on a one-to-one. Although you may have a span of control of 6, it's still leading one-to-one. And spans of control forever have been 6, 8, 10. Those are the right numbers for span of control, and I think it correlates with the 7 to 9 chunks of information the conscious mind can hold. But we're leading one-to-one. Now, this is not to be confused with managing a large group. So you can manage a call center. One person could manage a call center of 20, 30, even 100 people, but they're using technology. They're using technology to seeing the cues, the markers, etc., timings, and all of that. And what it does is it makes it possible, so you're not managing that. When I'm talking about spans of control, I'm talking about leading. And leading is taking people from where they are to where they want to be, or even helping them understand that where they want is not where they want to be, and where they want to be is over there, and here's how we're going to get there. That requires a one-to-one component. So that's why I distinguish between leading at the one-to-one level, which is like a team, and then leading at the one-to-many level, which is a group. And that gets into more setting of the climate. So whereas one-to-one is prevention, but it's also adjusting as you go. One-to-many is almost all prevention, because you've got to create that environment that there's positive outcomes are more likely. And so if you look at it from the 7-step standpoint, this is all pre-stimulus, steps 1 and 2. So in anxiety and self-mastery, this is the self-development step. We've got to be developed in such a way that our beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, physiology are aligned with our quest. There is somewhat of a ceiling here, because your self-development has to keep increasing to raise your ceiling. But this one is a very important step as well. Now, for the last 3 days, I used physiology as a placeholder or as a quick fix to look at the current state. But the state involves mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and then self image, which is your self talk. But you want to be aware of what that is. So I would say if this is self development, this is the awareness. And awareness is more like the spiritual part. And when I say spiritual, I don't mean spiritual realm. I'm talking about our highest self, where you can be aware that you're aware. You can be aware that you're aware that you're aware. Just like you're aware that we're having a conversation about awareness and about being aware. And then now you're aware of that. It can go on and on and on. The point is, you have to have that self-awareness to know, are you in a good place? This is important because if we're having up to 33,000 decisions a day, which are really 30,000 plus stimulus response cycles. 95% of what we do is done by habit. So we're going through this over and over and over. We're awake about 65,000 seconds a day. So every other second, we're being hit with another one of these. You don't notice it's happening at the unconscious level, but it's still happening nonetheless. So if we're already triggered in pre-stage fight or flight, neutral things that come up are going to be perceived as major threats. And then the response is not just the response. The response includes returning to positive mindfulness or returning to powerful present moment so that you're ready for that next conditioned reaction. So that's why I say that the step 2 is awareness, but physiology is a good way to check in on the dashboard. So it depends on how deep you want to go on here. As a coach, you're going to be paying more attention to each of these. Certainly the self-talk, which is an indicator of where the self-image is. Today we're talking about the step 3. This is where it all happens. This is a 1 second point in time where I would say is the major leverage point. I'd love to have people come on and chat with me about it because I'm going to map it to emotional intelligence. It's aligned with emotional intelligence. It's aligned with neuroscience. The reason I do it in 7 steps is because, and I'm going to expand this. 1 step is a model. I have a model of this. Now, this step is mostly ignored because it happens so quickly and it's just assumed to be habit. But also, people falsely make the assumption that this is happening as a mind event. It's not a mind event. It's a physiological cognitive processing. It's the network of neurons, most of it. Most of that step 3 is the network of neurons just processing energy. And you'll see that in that processing of energy, so if you think about the network of neurons, 100 billion neurons, each interacting with 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons or maybe more, and that is essentially where the habits reside. There's trillions of connections, all these associations, and the reason it can be so fast is because there's energy flowing through the neurons, and the more myelinated they are, the more synapses available neurotransmitter for those neural pathways, the stronger they can fire. And those paths of least resistance become your habits. And in stress, those paths of least resistance, highly myelinated, well synapsized, those become your default because it's in a threat situation, because it's what survival is. So I'm going to go through this step 3, and there's a connection to step 2, which I'll describe, and there's a connection to step 4. Step 4 is the conscious mind. So if you look at it in terms of stimulus, the stimulus happens right here, right before step 3, and your reaction time is about a quarter of a second for the subconscious, and then another half second for the conscious mind. So all in that first half second, anything that you're doing has to be programmed in at the subconscious level. It has to be done at the habitual level, which is what I mean when I talk about automaticity. So in talking about step 3, what I'll do is first break it down into its components. And again, this is aligned with emotional intelligence, it's aligned with neuroscience. But what I am choosing to do, because my audience is made up of lay people, it's not made up of neuroscientists, and my objective is to help people gain mastery over leading in leadership situations so that they can help other people become the best version of themselves, which means first they become the best version of themselves. So it starts with the 7 performance areas. 7 performance areas is where this all began, and what I needed was a way to help people cycle through the 7 performance areas and by cycling through the 7 performance areas with a step-by-step process, you're able to master them. The 7 performance areas are mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. So you have mental, physical, spiritual. Emotional is in the middle. Those are in your control. And then on the right side, you have relationships, professional and financial. Those require involvement with other people. And we're community beings. Humans are community beings. So this idea of everything's going to be done online, you can see it has limitations. And the 7 performance areas are a way for us to help work through transformation for self-mastery. But then you can also apply it as you're leading others. You have to know where people are. Where are they mentally, physically, spiritually? Where are they emotionally? And emotional is in the middle because it's like the gateway to the right side. You can easily be emotionally hijacked. You can do everything right on the left side, mental, physical, spiritual, but it get emotionally hijacked. This is where trust is lost. You build trust on the escalator going up, but it can be lost as fast as jumping out of a window going down. So that emotional part is very, very important, but it's actually in the 7-step process. It's step 5, the emotional modulation, but it also shows up in step 2 because in step 2, where you're checking in on yourself. As I said, that's like the physiology is the dashboard, but in this step 2, remember, you're looking at your mental state, physical state, spiritual state, emotional state. You're looking here, and if you're emotionally compromised, then you jump to step 5 and you apply, I shouldn't say jump to step 5, you apply the emotional modulation, the same emotional modulation that's in step 5. The difference between these two is this emotional modulation is processing an emotion that's existing. It's past. It's something that's coming up, some anxiety that's coming up. You can process that process it in real time, and you're doing it before that next condition, before the next stimulus comes on board. This step 5 is processing current emotions. So if you're being triggered by something that's coming up, that step 5 is to process that emotion so you can get back to an even keel and be in a position of strength and not one of reactivity or reactive survival responses, etc., survival reactions, I should say. Now, to me, this step 3 is huge. It's only 1 second, less than a second of this whole step, and we do 3,000 of these stimulus response cycles a day. You can look that up by asking how many decisions does a person make per day. It's going to say 30,000, 33,000, 32,000, whatever. And then if you ask what percentage of our lives are run by habit, what percentage of our actions and behaviors are by habit. So then you see, okay, so most of those decisions, the 33,000, most of those, like 31,000 and so, are habitual reactions or habitual patterns. And then you realize, okay, I'm making 33,000 decisions, but most of them I'm not even aware of. They tell us that 10,000 ad stimuli come across our awareness every day, but how many do you remember from yesterday? The point is you're filtering them out. The reticular activating system is filtering them out. Speaking of the reticular activating system, and I'm mentioning that this is aligned with neuroscience, it's aligned with emotional intelligence, and I bring that up because both of those disciplines have deep, deep, deep research, scientific research, peer-reviewed research, and you can rely on it. What I'm doing is I'm organizing it into a way that it makes sense for lay people. The challenge I have with neuroscience, and it's not a challenge with neuroscience itself, it's the way it's presented. One is neuroscience is still in its infancy. If the brain is hundreds of thousands of years old, and we've only had the brain scanning tools for the last half a century that can tell us what's going on in the brain, you can tell that neuroscience is still very, very much on a steep part of the learning curve. And the research tends to go deeper and deeper rather than wider, because to get peer reviewed, you have to get the same research has to be replicated, and you're not going to be able to do that if you're going out too wide. That's my way of explaining it. Emotional intelligence also has deep research on it. Now, both of those, and it's related, get to talking about what's happening where in the brain, because that's what the research is doing. They're doing the research in the brain, but when it comes to applying it, just try changing what's going on in your amygdala, and then you're going to you're going to slow down the handoff from the basal ganglia. You can't do it. So what I've done is taken these and said it's all neurons, all those parts of the brain, amygdala, hippocampus, all that's neurons, and neurons behave the same way. They fire together, wire together. For this level of the conversation, myelinated neurons fire faster, more and with more accuracy, faster and quicker. In other words, the impulse travels faster, but the reaction or the impulse comes quicker as well. And you need neurotransmitter for that to happen. If you're deprived of neurotransmitter, you're going to have slower impulse movement. The other thing is that thinking is energy. At its base level, thought is energy, and energy is going through the network of neurons, and there's a transition of energy that goes from the network of neuron type energy to thought energy. So that transition happens, and but it's opaque to people, right? This is why people think that what's coming from the network of neurons is actually thinking. So the I take out all of the terminology from neuroscience, because too often as you go down the rabbit hole of neuroscience, you constantly come across words that need explanation. You have to be able to define those words, and then it becomes difficult to understand. Remember, the mind can handle 7 to 9 chunks of information at a time, and you're throwing in all these definitions, you kind of lose. It's sort of like when you're reading a book, you come across a word that you don't know. It might take a page and a half, and you won't even, your brain is looking for context, so you completely miss everything that occurred in that 1.5, 2 pages because you've been looking for context. Similar, right? And then on the emotional intelligence side, the challenge is all the focus is what's going on in this part of the brain and that part of the brain, and we just can't get our hands around that. So what I've done is a 7-step process here, and then I have a model for what's going on in the 3-step, in the 3rd step. There's a model. I built a model for that, and I'll keep refining it. And this is where I would love to have some people who, especially emotional intelligence folks, and neuroscientists as well. But the emotional intelligence folks tend to be talking more about performance, leadership, things like that. So, and then we could have a nice mapping conversation to show how the model that I have lines up with the emotional intelligence, because the point is not to say I'm right, somebody else is wrong. The point is to make everything more accessible. I like what that line that says, Emily Fletcher, meditating, she says, the objective is not to be good at meditating, the objective is to be good at life. That's the point. The objective is not to be great at the 7-step model. The objective is to be great at life. The objective is not to understand all the parts of the brain. The objective is to be good at leading others to become the best version of themselves and to show up that way consistently. And that's the idea. And I approach these conversations from a point of view that says, if you disagree with me, then I disagree with me, until we figure out who's missing information. And that allows that conversation to unfold. And at some point you have to cut it off and say, okay, at this point we're going to stop here, but these are the things we agree on, these are the things we disagree on. And it's not about one being right or one being wrong. So that's in the chat. I put in the link that you can use to join me on stage. We can have a nice dialogue about this. I'll do it either way. We can do it live, which is what I'm doing now. This is live. But I then also edit some of these and republish them as edited or edited pre-recordings. And we can do it as recorded separately and then show it live. All right, now I'm laughing because I feel like this was a major breakthrough in terms of, so it all started because I wanted to break out what's going on in that 1 second. And that 1 second we have step 1, self-development. Step 2, awareness. We have step 4, which is like it's the response, but it includes action and follow-up. And then we have step 3. Step 3 is the 1 second. In this step, so if we say that this whole thing is 1 second, and it's going to be different because when you're stressed, it's going to happen faster. When you're relaxed, it's going to happen slower. This is where the link to HRV, so heart rate variability. The higher heart rate variability is, the more adaptable you are, the more you're going to take your time going through this and allowing it to unfold. The lower your heart rate variability, and that's generally going to be correlated with higher beta brain waves. In other words, you're stressed, everything, it's going to collapse. You're going to collapse some of these steps, if you will, or phases. So the first one is this is T minus 100 milliseconds. T minus 100 milliseconds, because this is the stimulus. That's where the stimulus happens, right here. So that's T. So T minus 100 milliseconds, the system is already learning. I think the technical term is 4 period, but think of it as pre-listening. Recording devices do it. Audio recording, especially, you have audio recording devices. When you hit record, it already picks up the dialogue from the prior 2 seconds. You also have video cameras that do that. When you hit record, it picks up the prior 2, and that's allowing for the human's reaction time. They're seeing something, I want to catch that. They hit record, it picks up the prior 2 seconds, which is a pretty cool feature. And that's similar to what the brain is doing. It's pre-listening, it's checking, it's predicting. It's always looking at the system and predicting. The example I would have is if you're riding a bicycle and you're coming across an intersection that you're not familiar with. Maybe it's a little sketchy. Maybe you see a car that looks like it's going to come out. You might cover your brake. Motorcyclists do this all the time. They're covering their brake going into an intersection. They're just ready. They roll off the throttle a little bit. They heighten their awareness. That's that pre-listening phase. And there's no stimulus yet, but you're ready. You're looking for cues. You're hyper aware of cues. And this is how your reaction time can drop from 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second, to something less than that, like 150 milliseconds, because you're hyper aware of it. You're already prepped for it. So that's always happening. So remember the 33,000 decisions a day. We're always having that T minus 100, which is why the state is so important. This here, it's so important because it's your state. And if your state is compromised, your pre-listening is already looking for too much trouble, and you're going to take neutral things and benign things and make them into mountains, right? The molehill to a mountain. So this is hugely important, as is your development to be able to get back to a nice, calm state on demand. And then the next thing we have is then you have this 250 milliseconds about, and it changes. But this is where you're first making the assessment. This is actually before you are even aware. You're not even thinking about this. This is that period of time where heuristics, cognitive biases, past experiences, these things are showing up there. One of the examples I use, if you've ever fallen off of a like at a playground or maybe a fence or whatever, you're climbing something, you fall, and it's like your life flashes before your eyes. It's like in milliseconds, like your entire life is whoosh, while you're still falling. Most people have experienced that. That, to me, is what's going on in this phase right here. Your brain and nervous system, they're looking for some clue as to what do I do. They're looking for some past experience of what do I do. This is why priming is so powerful. Priming comes into play here, but priming comes into play here too, because you've already told yourself what to think about it. But that's where you have your cognitive biases, heuristics, metaprograms, all of these things that are happening before you're aware. So this is the reaction time. Right? They say the subconscious has a reaction time of a quarter of a second. But it's not just doing nothing. It's looking at your past lived experience, which is why everybody responds to things differently. You start looking at your past lived experience and coming up with what's the likely solution to get out of this. Then the next one is I'll call it consolidation. And tomorrow I'll share more of the model and give terminology that more aligns with neuroscience. And the thing that I'm threading, the balance is to have descriptions that are aligned with neuroscience, and that neuroscientists would agree, yes, that's how it's happening, but they might disagree with the timing, for example. They might disagree with the exact wording, because I don't want to use neuroscientific terms because they all require more explanation. And how do you teach something if every other word or every other concept you introduce has to be defined and explained? So I look at this as sort of a consolidation of all of that. And it consolidates all of what was going on here, and it pulls it in, and then it hands off a reaction. It's sort of a recommended response. Now, you have another quarter of a second. I should say this line here is where the conscious mind can come online. So you have a quarter of a second with nothing, where you don't perceive anything going on. Then you have a quarter of a second where you have the reaction consolidated, and then the handoff to the conscious mind. But the challenge here is you don't want your response to equal your reaction. Now this is happening at 11 million bits per second. So if it's happening at 11 million bits per second, it's ultra fast, right? How you can't even fathom it. This conscious mind is 50 bits per second. So you need some time for the conscious mind to come online and at least get a little bit of understanding of what's going on. And this is why you need that pause. And it's not just a pause. What I would work in at the subconscious level is not just a pause, but to organize it in such a way that it's handing off to you something that's usable and practical. So I literally talk about taking the subconscious and conditioning it to provide an objective, a clear definition. So the first step of problem solving is clearly define the problem. So what I want is an objective definition of what's going on with that stimulus. I want it to be objective here so that now the conscious mind can use some of that speed, because the other thing that's happening here is the transition from signal to thought. And both of those are energy. So when you go from signal to thought, this is a transition. But because they're both energy, it's very easy for people to think, this is what I'm thinking. This was my thought. No, this wasn't your thought. This was your associations. This is where your thinking comes in. So you need time to get what's going on here. And in here is where you're also being aware of, am I being triggered? Is this high leverage? Is this high threat? Blah, blah, blah. And you may want to do the emotional modulation before you take action, because now you're going to have your response. And that's the handoff to step 4. And then from there you get into your action, and before you take action you do the emotional modulation. So I'll frame this out into a model tomorrow but I wanted to help people see that this 1 second model is what's happening over and over and over, which is why it seems so difficult to manage. So Atomic Habits, James Clear in Atomic Habits, he talks about the cue, right? The cue is over here. This is the cue, and he talks about preparing things. Like he talks about putting your gym clothes out in advance and all that. He talks about those cues in advance or preparing. So he's talking about like priming. So you're already more pre-wired, but you still have to understand what's going, or at least be able to manage what's going on in here. And this, as I said, it aligns with emotional intelligence, aligns with neuroscience, and then you go back into the other steps, which are action or emotional modulation, action, and then step 7 is returning back to mindfulness. Because remember, if we're doing this 33,000 times a day, you want to be ready for that next one that comes, or you're just making more yesterdays, making yesterdays like your tomorrows, or become the tomorrows, and we don't want to do that. Not unless you're in a very operational environment which you just want to stay the status quo over and over. My theme is leadership and leading into the field of infinite possibilities, and so you're going to have to be able to manage that. So I'm going to leave this out there for a bit, kind of dissect this. Tomorrow I'll map this to what I'm going to call the 7 phases of the 1 second model. And the reason I do everything in sevens is because of the 7 to 9 chunks of information, and it helps with my research. Because if I have 14 things and I'm trying to relate the unrelated, it's harder to see. When I have 6 or 7 things, I can more easily relate the unrelated because I can keep those unrelated things in my mind at all times. It's also easier to describe. I was told that this is why phone numbers in the U.S. anyway had 7 digits without the area code, 7 digits, because you can remember that this goes back into dial-up phones, etc., way before cell phones, and you had to remember your phone number, your girlfriend's phone number, and your whatever phone number, your job's phone number, and the school's phone number. You had to remember all those because we didn't have a computer in our pocket, and that's why I do everything in sevens. But tomorrow I'll talk about the 7 phases of the 1 second model, and I'll map it to emotional intelligence. And I'll map it to what's going on with, I'll call it quasi neuroscience terms, just to make this make more sense. But I wanted to describe it because we're all aware of priming, we're all aware of cognitive biases, which is happening here, and we're all aware of survival reactions. We've all had them. And what I'm not saying here, but is very true, the more stressed you are here, the more likely this is to not be productive. The more calm you are here, the more likely this is to be productive. And that's why hacks don't work. One reason hacks don't work is because of homeostasis, and the system's always wanting to get back to stability. And so it absorbs those anomalies. But the other reason hacks don't always work is because a hack that might work when you're at a higher heart rate variability, lower brainwave, that hack might work, but then when you're stressed out, low heart rate variability, high beta in your brain waves, then it won't work. And that's just an example, but we've got to look at this in the context of steps 1 and 2, but I'm going to stay on step 3 for a few days and then come back to tying it to the 2 and the 4, because this is 1 second, but it's making it manageable. So the difference between what I'm describing here versus the amygdala handing off to the prefrontal cortex is that this is actionable. You can actually do something about it. And then I'll introduce steps that we can take. For example, here is your own priming. We should be doing our own priming and use rituals. Here I have the positivity exercise so that the subconscious is not predisposed to looking at threats, but it looks at things as neutral, so we're less likely to fall into that fight or flight. And it's a lot easier to just go straight into focus and engage rather than trying to stop the cortisol and the adrenaline. And that positivity exercise happens here. Then here we have deep practice and also things like swish pattern, but deep practice is how we build new pathways, because the reason this happens is that it follows the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance is the high myelinated neural pathways. Highly myelinated neural pathways are the strong habits, and they're the ones that fire off. And the more stressed you are, the more likely you're going to fall into those highly myelinated, because if the subconscious or the network of neurons is looking at this as threat, it's obviously wanting to have you survive, and it doesn't have the ability to distinguish between a tiger level threat versus a small annoyance. And so you're following that path of least resistance, which is all the time. And then here is that pause. And when you understand that the network of neurons is is transitioning from a signal to what can be perceived by the conscious mind, you recognize the value of that pause. And even if you do nothing else but work to have a pause before you formulate your thought around something, you're going to make a big difference because you're able to see the whole thing. This is very similar. What's happening in here is very similar to if you've been in an argument with somebody and you bring up 2 or 3 words of what's going to be a 20-word sentence, and the first 3 words, they're already responding. And it's not bad listening skills. They're just hyper, and they're already in fight or flight. If you're a leader, this is why this gets into the one-to-one. If you're a leader and people are coming at you like that, don't try to use rationale, or don't. It's not. It's an irrational response because it's not a thinking response. It's a triggering association response, and you're better off just changing the subject, moving on to something else, working on something different. Let them calm down, because once you push past a certain point, it becomes that emotion that should process through, which we'll talk about how you do that on one-to-one when I get into February. But it's associations, and they're being triggered, and you can't stop them because it turns into a biological event. The emotion turns into a biological event, and the associations bring on other neurons, right? The ones that fire together wire together, and now you have this cascading effect of the house is on fire and everything is a survival reaction. So we'll get into that. I'll talk more about that tomorrow when I explain the 7-step model. All right, that's it. I'm going to sign off here. Feel free to join me tomorrow. See if anybody's out there looking to come in. You can just use that link. I always put this, the link is always on 7stepreset.com, which is I see, this is not, the comments are not showing. So there's the link, Studio Restream, ends in XYQ, and that link is also out on the 7stepreset.com/live, because on that website I put in the past event, and then I also put in, on that website I put in the past event, and I also put in the upcoming one. So I'll change it today. I'll change it to tomorrow's event, which will be part 2 of this model, and I'll also put this one in the previous slot. And then below that, you can find past, not all of them, but I've put some highlights that kind of help people understand, because I want to bring people along to understand step 1, step 2. And so there's one simple place people can go to see, I'll say, a representative video of when I was talking about step 1 and a representative one of when I was talking about step 2. And eventually I'll put some clean versions of 1 through 7, because I want them there for when I start talking about self-mastery, and then they'll evolve, and I'll be talking about leading one-to-one. All right, so I'll see you. I'm back on tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. 7stepreset.com/live for